Captain Novolin is one of those infamous titles from gaming history, about a diabetic superhero. It's been panned by most that have played it, but is the game misunderstood? Is it an innocent educational title? And the question is Captain Novolin worth playing today? Captain Novolin was released in 1992 by Reyes Systems and was developed by Sculptured Software. Sculptured Software is more well known for being a developer for publisher Acclaim. They changed their name in 97 to Iguana West and again in 99 to Acclaim Salt Lake City. They made titles such as Daydreaming Davy, The Simpsons Bart's Nightmare, that terrible port of Doom for the Super Nintendo, and most of the WWF related video games throughout the 80s and 90s until THQ got the license in the late 90s. Reyes Software was known for just making these educational titles with a health and safety twist to them. You had Rex Ronan, Experimental Surgeon, about not smoking. You had Packy and Marling, another diabetes-based game. Bronchi, the Bronchosaurus, about a dinosaur with asthma. And they were even working on a game that never got released called the AIDS Avenger. Reyes Software would use the small business innovative research in order to get a lot of the funds for their projects. They got almost $50,000 to work on Captain Novolin. The game was also sponsored by Novo Nordisk, which was a Danish pharmaceutical company and the makers of the Novolin brand of insulin, thus Captain Novolin. In Captain Novolin, you're playing as the titular character who is sent off to save the mayor, who also happens to be diabetic. He only has 48 hours worth of his insulin, so you have to get to him in time, and he's been kidnapped by aliens that are trying to take over the Earth by disguising themselves as sugary and bad foods. When you begin the game and all throughout it, you'll be hit with information about diabetes, insulin, and diet, what foods you should eat and when you should eat them when you're trying to manage your blood sugar levels. In an interesting mechanic, you actually have to manage your blood sugar level, making sure it's not too high and not too low. You have a spectrum that you will have to manage at the end of each of the stages, and you get to see kind of on a colored chart how high or how low your blood sugar level is, and you get a bonus if you're able to get it in the safe zone, which is represented by the color green. All throughout the levels, you will find various food items, and you have to decide how much food you want to eat or not eat, and because of this, you may end up passing out and lose a life because your blood sugar was too high or too low. Other than that though, the game is an action platformer where you're just moving to the right, jumping over enemies or stomping on enemies, and trying to get to the end of the stage while maintaining your health. Each life you can take 4 hits before you end up losing one. It's represented in the upper right corner by Captain Novolin's face, which will slowly disappear pieces of as you're losing health. Issues start to stem immediately though once you get control of Captain Novolin. He controls very sluggishly and clunky. Jumping is very sporadic. You start off by kind of jumping very slow, and then he'll pick up speed as he starts to spin in the air. In order to damage enemies, you have to jump and stomp on them, but not just land on top of them, you actually have to press down on the D-pad in order to stomp them. The hit detection on what is able to stomp and what doesn't count as a stomp is very finicky at the best and is different depending upon what creature you're dealing with at the time. There are moments where I should not have been able to stomp on a guy. I'm just right in front of him and hit down at the right moment and somehow count it, and other times I land directly on top of him with a stomp and I end up getting hurt. Because of the wonkiness of this mechanic, it leads to some pretty funny, humorous moments, as well as plenty of frustrating ones, especially when you're getting near the end of the game and only have a life or so left, and you end up getting a game over because of the bad hit detection. The game is broken up into 2 days, which is 8 levels in total. In fact, some levels will even stop you for a brief time in order to switch from breakfast to a mid-breakfast snack. Same goes for when you're moving from lunch and the dinner. The game has pretty generic themes for its stages, such as city, forest, mountain, and finally the alien spaceship, which is probably the most interesting of the levels. You start off though with the back-to-back city levels, which are almost identical, though the monsters in them change up. You have bouncing donuts and cookies, walking soda cans, and a plethora of other food items that you're going to have to deal with. Some of the more annoying enemies come later in the game, like the Twizzlers that can twist around and be a little bit difficult to judge exactly if they're going to be able to hit you or not. And then annoying enemies that have projectiles like ice cream that throws, well, ice cream at you, and bubblegum packets that blow bubbles at you. After you get done the city stages, you then move on to the first of 2 boat levels. Here you get to control Captain Novolin in a speedboat, getting to still collect food, which is somehow flying, walking around. The food in this game is pretty much sentient, which is really disturbing in a lot of ways. In the boat, you still have the same basic controls, being able to jump really high up in the air and stomp on enemies. The expression on Captain Novolin's face when you get a lot of air in the boat, though, says it all. He just feels like every time he makes this jump, he's like, wow, I just made a huge mistake. His eyes bug out of his head, and it's absolutely hilarious. After the first boat stage, you move through the forest. Here a few new enemies are introduced, and for the most part is a pretty straightforward level. Right after that, though, is another boat level, which is just slightly more difficult. Here, the bubblegum packets that you dealt with in the first boat level now start to shoot those bubbles at you, and the hit detection and being able to land on top of them sometimes is pretty difficult. The next 2 stages are the mountain levels, and here you have a few pits that you can actually fall in and end up losing a life that way, as well as they throw bunches of enemies, 2 or sometimes 3 enemies at a time at you. The game is not very much optimized, so it ends up slowing down and chugging at times when you have multiple enemies on screen. The final level of the game is the alien spaceship, which at least looks a little bit interesting. There's an immediate trap at the very beginning with electricity running through an open panel. It's just a couple of steps from the beginning, so if you're not careful, you'll probably run into it the very first time you play the game. The rest of the level is pretty generic, just a few traps here and there and the other enemies we've already been dealing with throughout. At the end of the stage, though, you do have to face off with a boss. He has a switch that will end up putting electricity towards him or towards you, as well as he throws pies at you. Yes, the final boss of the game just hits you with pies. It's easy to dodge this electricity as well as the pies, but if you just want to cheese it, just walk right up to the lever and duck. Nothing can hit you, you're ended up able to hit him, and after 3 hits to him, he's defeated and you're able to save the mayor. When you do save the mayor, you do get a trivia question that will end up getting you bonus points if you get it right. This changes up every time you play the game, so if you're just mashing the button, you may end up getting the question wrong if you expect it to be one answer or the other. However, it doesn't affect anything other than a few extra bonus points, and you're still able to get the ending to the game. The entire purpose of Captain Novolin's existence was to help kids better understand diabetes. Doctors and parents would use this as a way to kind of better educate them as far as the diet and other things, and using a video game is actually a good idea to help kids with these problems. The only issue is Captain Novolin is not a very fun playing game. Not surprisingly, it was a small team that worked on Captain Novolin. The head game designer was actually Perry Rogers. He was actually a member of the USA video game team from the early 1980s, which was put together as some of the best video game arcade players of the time, and he's a former record holder on the likes of Galaxian and Mario Brothers, and would go on to work for Sony for many years at their publishing firm, being able to work on titles such as Crash Bandicoot Warped, Crash Team Racing, Final Fantasy VII, Wild Arms, so on and so forth. Mark Gatiss, who was one of the audio leads and sound effects creators for the game, worked on Call of Duty Modern Warfare 1 and 2, as well as Boogerman, a pick and flick adventure. Not surprisingly, I never really heard of Captain Novolin back in the early 90s when it first was released, and didn't become aware of it really until the late 90s and early 2000s when emulation and ROMs really became a thing. Captain Novolin's never been re-released in any way, but I wouldn't say it may never get re-released, because we have seen the likes of some Wisdom Tree games getting some re-releases, and even Bubsy has made a return, so obscure games can make a comeback from time to time. However, is Captain Novolin worth playing today? No, not really. It's a pretty poor action platformer that just is worth a couple of laughs. Just the absurdity of it even existing. Even though it was created for a worthy purpose, it's too bad the game just isn't any good. You can get a copy nowadays for $35 to $40 for just the card, or over $100 if you want a complete copy for your collection, and honestly I don't really think that's worth tracking down. But anyway guys, that's gonna wrap up this retro review. I'd like to thank you for watching, and of course I hope you enjoyed.